Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable appreciating short fiction a single story at a time. My name is al-Sirgany, and I'm here today with Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
And Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi, everyone.
And we're here to discuss a piece from Your Duck is My Duck by Deborah Eisenberg. The story itself is Your Duck is My Duck, whereas I hope Matthew will later elaborate on Our Duck is the Same. The title story of Eisenberg's collection, which is told from the perspective of a painter who, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, takes an offer from two rich art collectors to join them at their foreign property for a sort of informal residency. While there at their home, the painter, who becomes acquainted with the couple after they buy a piece of hers sold to them by her former boyfriend, befriends a puppeteer, Amos, who is much more overtly judgmental, but also an escapee of the recession-era New York. The two of them observe the devolution of the couple's relationship as the environment around them literally collapses, and the husband makes a deal that will give, I won't say earn, him a great deal of money. So that's a sort of summary of the many things that happen in this story. There are many more. It's a fairly long story. Did I miss anything, guys?
Well, I mean, I guess I have one question for you. Like, how do you know he earns a lot of money?
I think the deal is intended to earn him a lot of money in the proposition, which I'm basing on the hyper-confidence and the chest bumping of the kind of legalese group that comes in through the place. I don't know that he actually makes the money in the end.
Yeah, I think that's a good add in that, Krista and Ray are clearly very rich, but that particular investment seems to be one of the fragile things in the story.
Right, yeah, I brought it up because I think, these, what do they call them? Accountants and or architects and or lawyers that are also at the house as guests feel very confident in what they're going to do for Ray, right? But there is that notion that Krista says they're going to be gone in a few days, or they're going to be gone tomorrow, something like that. Meaning, it seems to me like Ray's demeanor at dinner that night, where he chastises them for drinking too much and joking about absurd things, and telling them, remember, if this deal fails, I'm not hitching my wagon to yours because of this clause that you signed in our agreement.
Yeah.
Like, you will sink by yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing, especially like where we're going to probably start off talking.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions about the specifics of the relationship of the couple, of sort of the transitional moments of the relationship that the painter has to her ex-boyfriend. A few unanswered questions about Amos as a person in general. Lots of unanswered questions about the community. But this piece in particular, and where I'd like to start thinking about it, is actually the language it uses that creates some of those ambiguities, and also that creates some of the odd specificities of the tale. The whole collection of Your Duck is My Duck is hyper engaged with language, the loss of language, the interpretation of language, as a medical condition, as a way of being as a way of communicating. This story, I think, doesn't do that as overtly as some of the others, but it does get at some of the vaguenesses and possibilities of what words do. One moment early on that really interests me is actually where Krista, the wife, describes her husband Roy as Mr. Sangfroid. And she does that because he's scratched the Mercedes after taking a sleeping pill, and then he's blaming one of their employees. I think the wit is spot on, but I also find this to be a sort of compelling foreshadow of the puppet show that the puppeteer Amos Voinovich is going to put on at the story's end, and which shows or kind of orients the direction that the narrator herself will take with an email to her ex-boyfriend Graham when she takes the same medication that Roy has taken without knowing it. I'm also thinking about Amos and the way he talks about who these people are and how that's translated into his puppet show, and the name of that puppet show, which he originally calls The Hand That Feeds You, and when he finally performs it, calls it State of Emergency. My big question about all of those many things that are happening is, what role are label and metonym and assertion of the facts, as Amos puts it, playing in this story?
Well, I think that's a really smart question. It's a story that pays careful attention to language, and you see that from the opening line. I want to read that because I think it's an interesting example of how language works frequently, like a pattern that we see throughout the story. So way back, not all that long ago, actually just a couple years, but back before I'd gotten a glimpse of the gears and the levers and pulleys that dredged the future up from the Earth's core to its surface. I was going to a lot of parties. So it's very funny, but you see even in that first line, the way back immediately gets qualified and specified a little more, but not in a way that's much more specific. I think that's something I see quite a bit in this story. I think also, in that attention to language, we get symbols that come up, and we also, like you said, get kind of casual metonyms and sort of broader, more thematic ones. One example of a casual metonym I noted was that I think is important to the overall setting of the story is, one that would almost just glide by because of what we all know about New York. He looked a little disgusted, as if to remind me that he had a downtown office, and I was not the first self-obsessed hysteric he dealt with that day. So this is the narrator talking about getting sleeping pills back in New York. She's talking about the interaction that she had with her doctor. I think we know that downtown here is stand-in for, a place where artists and hysterics live. It's a quick, casual one, but the story's operating so carefully that, it's one of many, many examples. Another I pulled was at the Exchange Bureau. The narrator's arriving, and she exchanges her few sober monochromatic bills and replaces them with a thick, fortifying sheaf of festive ones that looked like they were looking to get loose and party. The language is so funny there. We're paying attention to like the kind of symbols on the bills and what something as casual as cash, something that we pay so little attention to as object that is exchanged and used to that purpose, gets this careful attention that, you start to think about those sober monochromatic builds versus more festive ones and the kind of mood that might put you in, as well as in a recession, again, cueing to like the broader scenario that we find ourselves in, what it would be to have just a few bills, to be worried about money, and then to be handed a big stack of bills on your vacation, to be able to be in this place where your money might be literally thicker, but also might go a little farther.
I get excited with the playfulness in the language, in that, like, immediately in the story, we are at this party where the narrator meets Ray and Krista, right? And the music's so loud that people are just like shouting at each other, but no one can hear each other. So it's like we've all gathered together here in this place to drink and yell at each other, but not actually say anything. And the only people that can actually be heard are the young women who speak like they're Donald Duck, right? And this makes the narrator feel old in a very strange way, because she doesn't talk like a cartoon duck, right? This also plays into, the story's title, Your Duck is My Duck, because, like, in and of itself, right, she's also comparing her older self to her younger self, even as she's, like, kind of pissed off at these younger women who are at a different point in this so-called game of popularity and interconnectedness through who you know and so forth, and like people are listening to them because they're younger, and right, they have this cloying quality to them that like you can't but miss, right? And then I think to move a little later, I really enjoy the idea of making up the medications that are taken in the story, right? Like, our narrator has a terrible time sleeping, and as Adam referred to earlier, right, she sends this drug-induced email to her ex-boyfriend Graham. Well, she gets the drugs from Krista because Krista finds out she can't sleep, and those particular pills are called Vex Nixes, right? Like, that's going to do something good for you, right? We already know Ray is running around driving the car at night and running into objects on Vex Nixes. They're called Vex Nixes, right? An insane thing to take in order to like get some restful sleep. And then later, the narrator is worried about Krista, who's taking all kinds of drugs. Notably Crystalline, Levolol, and hedonolics, right? Like the Crystalline and Levolol, like being these, in my opinion, like these ideas that you'll rise above or at least level up, right, by taking these, and so that in society you perform the function that has gotten you to the point in society that you are in. And then hedonolics, right, obviously hedonistic,
Yeah.
right? So like they're gonna do whatever they want to do to make them feel good. And so I found those both like charming and frightening at the same time, in that like that's how we often name things and speak, with a sort of code. An example of that would be like, to jump ahead but not really talk about it, after the puppet show happens, Ray's comments are, well, so, right? Like that tells us a whole lot, but he doesn't actually say anything, right? So I like to think about how, his particular recap of the puppet show and what it entails is, well, so, as opposed to like trying to break down what it is he finds offensive to him in it, you know.
Yeah. I think to that point, the puppet show itself, which I'd like to say with one thing that ends up coming up about the puppet show is when it's performed at Ray and Krista's home. At this point, Amos and the narrator are living in a guest cottage off to the side. But Amos performs the first act, and it is dealing with a sort of coup d'etat sort of revolution. I'll let one of you take on trying to describe the puppet show, which presumably has a kind of, you know, archetypal quality that Roy and Krista wouldn't want to fall into. My point is that it doesn't. It executes something that terrifies Ray and Krista, but it carries on, and we only get a summary of that. But the puppet show is, you know, like the play in Hamlet or any number of other examples. What's called in literature and art a mise or a mise en abîme, meaning placed in an abyss and in art, and I think that's relevant here because of what the painter is up to, because of what that usually means is an image of an image inside the image, inside the image, inside the image, ad infinitum. In literature, it's usually a performance that takes place within a novel or a story or a play that somehow is reflective of the larger story or play. So I think that the puppet show is the most obvious example of this, right? Like, Amos is intentionally speaking to the kind of collapse that he believes that Roy and Krista are bringing and what's bound to happen to them. But there are these infinite other little hellscapes, some of them a little bit larger, some of them a little bit smaller, of the moment that the story is set in. The recession itself, or, you know, the narrator's confused breakup with Graham. And I think it isn't only speaking to those tragedies, but is saying something about the kinds of people that have come to be at Krista and Roy's themselves. Amos knows to take the money and the time, but to avoid what's going on up at the main house. So does a story always work this way in literature, or work the way that it does here? And what does it do particularly here through the puppet show and some of the other internal narratives?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert of all the literary works in the world. Sure. So I don't know that I can answer if it works that way in literature all the time. What I would suggest is that I feel like it often works that way. And at least one of the reasons for that happening in that particular manner is that in a short story, at least, which is what we're focusing on, there is, generally speaking, a limited amount of time in which the story unfolds. And so that whatever happens in a short story particularly is put in proximity to the larger story itself, right? So if we've got a play such as we do in this, you can't help but equate it to the larger story. Sure. I think, you know, it often happens this way to us because as humans, we are trained to find meaning in things. And that even if a particular insertion of a story within a story, etc., is put in there, we're going to try to connect it in some way. Now, Is it always the case that they are connected? Maybe, maybe not. I think we can have certain discussions on that. But in some certain way, because most things are written by one person, aren't we experiencing a continued outpouring of what the writer's particular interests are while they're writing the story?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with that. That there's a way in which your own experience as a creator involves always just what you're experiencing and how you're mediating it to whatever capacity you do. And we all have a certain number of things we can hold in our beings.
Yeah, Matthew, I think what you're saying is really compelling, especially about sort of the literary version of montage, that if we get two images, of course we're going to compare naturally. I think, like you, I can't speak for all of literature, but I don't think you're asking us to, Adam. I did sit and try to think about a few examples of stories within stories and plays within stories, and I would say that, I think, Matthew, you're so on point when it comes to, like, the fact that when we get a story or a play within a story, we're primed to think about how it relates to the story, and if there are any foils or comparisons that we should be looking at. I can think of a few examples where it doesn't quite work that way. Chekhov's story, The Student, has a lovely retelling within it, and what you get at the end is the student sort of ill-tempered and sort of put off by the weather and the fact that he's hungry early on in the story, and he's told a story by a peasant woman, and what ends up happening is he ends up feeling the story sort of within his body. So he relates to the characters, but I think you're not primed to look for foils in just that way. I think another thing that I would point out about how the performance in particular is functioning, I just finished reading Turgenev's The Singers within Saunders' new critical book, which is wonderful. And one thing that he points out, Saunders, about this story that is really fascinating, I think, is that we end up looking to characters for their reactions quite a bit, to also nod to something you were saying, Matthew, about Ray's response to the play. I will quickly take on trying to summarize the plays.
Thank God.
So the first one, there's actually a performance that gets described that the narrator has already seen, so she's familiar with Amos's work and seems to like it. The first play that gets described is about explorers and their ambition. There are dogs who sing of doubts, longing, loyalties, resentment. I'm quoting the story there. There's a chorus of penguins who know what's bound to happen. And I mean, I think this sets me up to start looking for equivalents and for foils. When we come to the actual play that Amos is putting on, it's very pointed. It's not at all subtle. And, it's not hard to find those equivalents. There's the castle, there's the greedy king, the trophy queen, the ravenous alligators, who are circling the moat. Those are the accountants and the engineer and architect. There are the soldiers and army poised at the walls, protecting vats of boiling oil, and oil factors in terms of the eucalyptus that Ray is growing. that keeps catching fire. There are king's generals, there are enemy serfs, importantly. They have donkeys that are mining underground caves. There are bat messengers and donkey strategists. I think importantly, like, not everything has an exact equivalent here, but many of these characters do. The greedy king equals Ray very easily, the trophy wife, Krista, the ravenous alligators, the accountants. So you start thinking about that, and I mean, I think a really interesting thing that happens here, as in, a really famous example, Hamlet, is the narrator is influenced in a causal way by the performance. So it actually enters into one of her dreams. She dreams that she's a serf toiling in the tunnels. So I actually don't set her up in my head as a serf. I think of the villagers as serfs. But she equates herself with the serfs and ends up writing a drug-induced email or sleeping pill-induced email to Graham, describing herself as, a serf. But I think one place I want to go to with this is, I think it's really interesting to think about the narrator's response to the performance in particular, and to Amos in particular. She finally describes it as accident that selects her to observe what's going on in this place. She ends up painting the trees that are burnt. And, I think this is really different from Amos's reaction to what's going on around him, the sort of performance he creates, and, even his attitude toward Ray and Krista. So, Adam, I'll let you keep trudging along, but maybe that's something we could all bear in mind and think about.
Yeah, I think that the two artists, Amos and the narrator, they have different senses of how they should act and what their obligations are, and the way in which they engage creation and how they're motivated by these things. It's actually mostly through Amos and his description that we get that the kind of tragedy of the world around them. The narrator tells us about very specific sort of anxiety-producing moments in her experiences with Roy and Krista, and her kinds of confusion around the people who are coming in and out. Amos, when she's arrived, has already befriended the cook and has been out into the village and has opinions on what's happening to the village and has the facts, as he puts it.
I guess if I can add one more thing. In seeing the performance, she describes herself as feeling miniaturized, and she feels as if she's been living in that splendid castle, pacing its red stone floors with silk hangings. Amos is clearly satirical, which I think is really fitting, especially as a puppeteer. That space's history and the way it engages the world and plays with the world. I think I find it really telling that she gets so engrossed in the play, but also doesn't seem to be responding to the play's intentions in quite the way that the play wants her to. She's seeing the castle as splendid.
I think one thing that's maybe different, I suppose, about thinking about the story within a story regarding Your Duck is My Duck, is that the title itself actually situates us within a story that's already taken place before, and is not taking place currently, in that, right, it's part of this Zen riddle. And so not only a story, but a riddle. And, the whole point of a riddle is to make the teller feel empowered in a certain way that I see it. In that, like, it's like, guess what the answer is. And you're going to get, like, these ridiculous clues that seem to have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard for you to answer the riddle, which is why, we have such amazing stories as, like, solving the riddle of the Sphinx or something like that, right? They seem larger than life because it seems impossible for the person who's not been, like, touched in some way by the absolute power of omniscience to, like, actually answer the riddle. And so I think, like, that's one thing that this particular story is, like, setting up, is that, sometimes the answer to a riddle is that there is no riddle.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I think that Amos ends up demonstrating that through the repetition a little bit. I am, after those wise thoughts, going to jump ahead to the riddle itself to help contextualize it. So the title of the story comes from a Zen riddle wherein a master, his disciple, and a duck are trapped in a bottle. That's according to Roy. And the moral of that riddle for Roy is, quote, "It's not your duck. Quote, "It's not my duck. It's not my bottle. It's not my problem." So I had a hard time grasping what the story could be behind this one. I wasn't familiar with the koan, and I looked it up, and what I found was a story that involves a group of students who come to a Zen master and ask to be taught Zen. And the master explains to these students that he's raised a duck in a bottle, but the duck has grown in the bottle and is now too big to get out. He tells the students that he wants not to break the bottle and he doesn't want to hurt the duck. So the students, they're puzzled about the problem, they're thinking about it, no one comes up with a solution, and a little girl walks by and she says, "We'll just break the bottle." And the Zen master praises her, and the students are confused by this because the Zen master explicitly doesn't want to break the bottle or hurt the duck, and the Zen master explains to them that you have an impossible problem, and so that you get your duck or you get your bottle, but you can't have both. And so the little girl has recognized that in and of itself, which brings us back to what you noted off the top, Matthew, that we don't know how this deal ends up working out. We don't really know what happens to Roy and Krista at the end of the story, and we do get some indications about the kind of negative, for lack of a better term, shitstorm that kind of goes on in the community where they were. But my question to you is this: what do you think about this riddle, and where are the ducks here in this story?
Well, I think I see the riddle being a lot about trading, and also about fragility, as you point out. So I started to think about the kinds of trades that characters make within the story, and when they're specifically trying to get it all and they're getting one thing, or when they're recognizing that they're trading. Actually, I think many of the characters are pretty aware of the trades they're making. So the narrator, for example, back in New York, tries taking sleeping pills that one time, but notices that as an artist, and just as a person as well, that she has a sort of blunted effect on the pills. So she ends up flushing them and is skeptical of the ones that Krista offers her. Amos has been evicted from his apartment and, in a very self-aware way, makes it clear that he's come to stay with Ray and Krista, but he's doing it on his terms, and that he's very aware that he's supposed to play the entertainer to them, and comprehends the trade that he's entered into, and isn't doing his part, setting boundaries that he does have the power to set. I think the local people are a little less aware of what they're getting into when Ray and Krista and Zafran, the model, enter the picture. And that's not to their fault. Things are complicated. So Ray introduces a cash crop because there have been a lot of environmental disasters, heavy rains, and difficulty growing crops there. But I mean, interestingly, the locals are initially very enthusiastic about Zafran and Ray coming in for the most part. I guess we do get a little less on the page about how they receive Ray. But some of them sell land to him, some of them leave, presumably. But there are a lot of long-term consequences there. So, I mean, I think, to apply that back to the riddle, it's a little like, oh, you might get some tourism from these donkey rides immediately, or you might get some money for this crop, but, you are losing your home, or this land is getting damaged because you don't know what the eucalyptus is going to do. These kinds of things, consequences that are foreseeable, consequences that are unforeseeable, consequences that are deeply bound and intertwined and confusing.
I mean, I think the duck can be seen as many different things, but maybe the most prevalent for me is that each person is a duck, and that we're all given a life, and each person has different aspirations in their life. And for this story in particular, right, we have people that want to make more money, we have people who want to make good art, and we have people who just want to survive. Those are, if we were to break them down, those are kind of the three categories of people in this story. And, by bringing in the Zen to this particular story, Your Duck is My Duck, the Zen riddle, what is Zen but a teaching of being in the moment and basically learning how to breathe when everyone that lives has to breathe. And so you're not necessarily taught how to breathe, outside of the fact that there are some complications with the birth or something, right? You're born with this inherent ability to breathe. And so you already know how to breathe, and yet you want someone to teach you how to breathe, right? So it's I'm trying to improve my duck, my life, to make myself feel better in the world, either for myself or in my relation to others, right? I want to be seen as, something maybe better than a duck. And so it really makes me think about the game Duck Duck Goose. Because everyone is a duck until someone calls someone else a goose.
Yeah.
And then there's a chase. Right? So, like, that is kind of, in a nutshell, how the world works, right? Like, you know, everyone maybe at one time was on a fairly equal standing, and then someone called someone something else, and the world's gone to shit since then. Right? Like, that's a simplistic way of thinking about it, and I realize that. But, like, this inherent, like, naming of things, to kind of go back to the language question that we were talking about, and the idea to, like, print money that's one color versus another color, to say, like, I'm going to ink this paper a certain way and call it money. Like, all of this is just, like, a ridiculous scheme for certain people to have more power than other people and to, like, be a more magnificent duck than this other duck.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, it's simplistic, but the story's engaging play in just the way you're talking about. I mean, I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if Eisenberg were thinking a little bit about Duck Duck Goose as well, and I think especially engaging Amos's plays and thinking about the kinds of labels he's applying, but also the way the narrator is looking at wealth within New York City and the kind of people but caricatures that we encounter in this story.
For sure. I think this is a horrible thing to have to say after your discussion of the relative arbitrariness of label, but I feel obliged to note that in my notes, being the blind fucker that I am, I wrote down Roy 100 times, and I've been saying Roy and not Ray this entire time. But, you know, the rich are rich first, I assume. And anyhow.
Well, it's Siegfried and Roy, right?
Yeah.
Sang Freud.
Sang Freud and Roy.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. No.
You've gotten into the clownishness of this whole ordeal, which is the amazing aspect of the story.
Yeah.
I think you should feel good about that.
Thank you. Thank you. The less clownish aspect of the story is that, as Ingrid noted, you know, the townsfolk and the various, like, people who end up working for Krista and Ray are a little less present, although they do get mentioned. Amos in particular takes an interest in them. He's also the first person to tell us that the village around Krista and Ray's estate is collapsing, in part because of Ray's cash crop. And he also notes that this has led to various economic problems. People are leaving, so on and so forth. As Ingrid also mentioned, there is a model Zaffron who Roy is shacking up with, as early on in the story we learn occasionally Ray does, but occasionally so does Krista. That's part of how their casual rich flair works. But Zaffron comes in and brings a whole tourist industry behind her. People are fascinated with her fame in a kind of People magazine way. And none of this helps the fact that the land around them is literally dropping into the sea.
Yeah, I forgot to contextualize. Can I interrupt for
Please.
a second? So Zaffron is a model, and as a result of a shoot that she does, the shoot ends up bringing, I guess because of her poses with donkey rides to the village, and the stylist idea of putting cute bells and fringe on the donkeys is something that the locals take up.
Yeah.
Um,
Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
I think that the town is obviously the bottle or the primary bottle of this story. Maybe the world mistreated by the economy is the slightly larger bottle of the story, but the town is the most immediate bottle that's going to be broken amidst all these ducks. What's happening in the town is obviously part of the mise en being. But how else does the town, how do its people play a role here? In what ways do the townspeople, who are mostly, when we see them serving Krista and Ray, operating in the story, and how does that differ from the way that other characters or how is it similar to how other characters like the kind of accountant, lawyer trio operate, or the various folks who kind of hop in and out, who are wealthy and just happen to be there for a while?
I mean, I think one of the most telling things is their absence from the narrator's perspective.
Yeah.
Meaning, she is somewhat intrigued by watching the locals try to get out, to escape on any boat.
Yeah.
Right? Pretty soon they build a shack city right on the edge of the water in order not to miss a boat that they could potentially escape the hell that is becoming this island, both through the loss of land and through the fire, because the oil from the eucalyptus keeps getting set on fire by lightning and other things. And so these are people desperate just to survive, and yet what does she do? She paints the trees on fire, right? Certainly she recognizes these people are there and so forth. Yeah. And she is helped out by Fred even to just get the materials to do a painting of burning trees.
Yeah.
And yet her focus is on relaxation, being able to sleep, moving up in the art world, right? Those are her things. And so we see that even knowing that Amos's play is going to be about what Amos's play is, she still claps after the first part is over, knowing it's only intermission. And so to me, this just says I have my goals, and I'm gonna try my best to get to these goals and ignore the things that don't particularly harm me or are not my business. Much like, Ray, who's the Zen master says, it's not my duck, it's not my bottle, it's not my problem, right? And so if, as you say, which I would agree with, this particular island is the bottle, right? She's only here to take certain things from the bottle, and it's a type of exchange because certain things are expected of her, but it's a monetary exchange and an exchange in privilege.
Yeah.
And at the expense of nullifying this land as land.
Yeah.
In this home base of these people as a home.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think I overgeneralize things.
No, I think that's really, really critical to how the story gets read. I think the only action that action in the sense that the narrator goes out and does something toward a goal, ends up being, interestingly, the moment where she's taken the sleeping pills from Krista, who gave them to her, or offered them up to her. She casually asks what they are. She has a moment where she wonders what they are, and then takes them anyway. Has written a nearly incomprehensible email to her ex-boyfriend, and she worries about her relationship to the ex-boyfriend, not just going like, hey man, I took some sleeping pills, but like takes a certain offense at this, worries out what he has to say about her in analyzing it, and then goes to berate Krista for giving the pills, which then leads to Ray leaving the house and like taking up with Zaffron. And I think that insofar as the kind of causal chains of the story happen, when the narrator bears a direct responsibility, when she undertakes something, it happens to be about herself. And I think there's a lot of questions I have but couldn't answer for you about what kind of privilege that speaks to, even in her experience, right? Like, because the town is a sort of object of use for everyone, maybe least of those who aren't native to the town. Amos, but Amos also is using the town as a place to narrativize and make art out of, and to craft that other world. But I don't entirely know what to do with all that, but I don't think it's something the story wants us to ignore.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're actually moving toward that. I guess what I would say is, Matthew, I think you're so right that the narrator is sort of a passenger in her own life, at least at this juncture. She's surprised at things that are happening to her, and doesn't know what to do with them. I think one example that comes immediately to mind is when she first sort of summons Graham to her side, like an apparition. Krista has sent her all these instructions about coming to the island, but she's forgotten to create like an international phone plan, do what she needs to with her phone, and she's realizing that Graham did those things for her before. I think in a pleasant sort of way, she's complicated. She's clearly adrift, and she's clearly struggling herself. Sometimes her problems relative to the ones that are surrounding her seem petty and insignificant. But I think she doesn't seem to be in a place to see other people's problems and know what to do with them and take action. And also, she's trying to be an artist, and I think one thing that is nice about seeing her and Amos side by side is, while he is working with puppets and, engaging satire in a very specific kind of way, I think we see the ways in which his work verges on maybe too polemical, whereas, there's a difference between politics and art, and they meet, but they meet carefully. So I think all that's at work, and I totally agree about the narrator being adrift and irresponsible and complicated in that way. I think of the locals, and to just go back to that, these side characters, I think you're right that they're mainly missing, and that's that's what's being said about them. The one that we see the most is Fred, who we don't even necessarily know his real name. That's apparently just what Krista and Ray call him. Fred, what we know about him is that he's the driver, but he does everything. And there's a dependency on him when he storms off because of Ray's Mercedes accident. Krista ends up picking up the narrator at the airport and, is flustered and put out by this. But Fred, like you said, stretches the canvas for the narrator, helps with supplies, helps do the lighting for Amos's plays. He's just integral in every way. But no one seems to know much about him with certainty. The narrator is always doubtful when she's talking about Fred. She says he doesn't speak English well, but, just says very vague things about his life and what he's doing, and clearly hasn't made much of an effort to get to know the facts of his life.
Well, and like everything, I think that's a great point about Fred, because everything we're told about Fred is almost all secondhand or third hand, either from the narrator or from Amos. And Fred's big line, his one dialogue in the story is donkeys. That's his one dialogue. To appreciate the donkeys that they see on the drive to get the materials for her to paint.
Yeah.
And that's coming from our narrator. And I also want to say I really like your use of passenger for the narrator, because I was thinking literally of sleepwalking the entire time, because she is not only sleepwalking, but conjuring the type of life that she wants, right? The apparition of Graham is more to her liking than Graham himself. And even in the email that she writes to Graham, right, love is L*****,
Yeah.
right? Because she has no idea what that is. But at the same time, who does? As a word, it is possibly the most overused and understood words in the language.
Yeah.
Just because it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's trying to describe an emotion that is so difficult to describe that it's almost, impossible to formulate some sort of thing or word to express it.
Yeah.
Right. The final thing I want to say before I jump off my little bandwagon here is that I love the fact that the narrator is conjuring apparitions of Graham, and Amos is generally happy that all of the apparatchiks are not in residence at this time. They only come to shit on his play and leave. And that's the only time they appear, but they don't bother him the rest of the time that he's there.
Yeah. I think I really want to move toward.
Sorry.
No, I think I'm really compelled by what we're getting at, and I want to move toward that. Because the story actually, for the most part, it begins and it ends in New York, right? And it actually ends. It begins with the narrator, kind of seeing Krista and Ray and their kind of glamour. It ends back in New York, and the narrator is having coffee with Amos, who they meet once in a while. He's been traveling around and showing his play. She's presumably had a comfortable enough artistic life, and she asks Amos if he thinks about Krista and Ray from time to time. And he says that not that much. But both of these people, right, have been elevated. Throughout the story, we get both from Graham about the narrator and the narrator herself, that because Krista and Ray are well off in the way that they're well off, because they're art collectors, that the provenance, I think is the word, has been elevated of her work, and that may help her out. Amos, of course, already has some steam going, but he's now out in the world. He's traveling to Germany and doing his shows and so on and so forth. He's, so I'm wondering about that, the circularity of the story, the New York to New York circularity, but also this, maybe not circularity, but intertwining of dependency between the artists and the wealthy, the apparatchiks, and the wealthy, and how these folks are interacting with one another.
Well, I mean, maybe to go back to answer one of your questions, I joked with you after we first read the story that it should be called Our Duck is the Same.
Yeah.
Because it's like totally zen, and, basically what the title is saying anyway.
Yeah.
And so in that way, like, talking about it as circularity or intertwining, either one, I think it's this idea of, I guess maybe the first thing that it brings to my mind is that, birds of a feather flock together.
Yeah.
For lack of a better metaphor or something. In that, the two artists, both, as you said, are uplifted by Ray and Krista and are able to live a life in New York again.
Yeah.
And at that point, right, they were both like done in New York. And so they have succeeded in some manner. And so, right, they're trying to write each other's coattails in a certain way, even if they're in different disciplines, so to speak.
Yeah.
But they continue to meet, right? Because, like, we have found a way to, like, rise above the people that haven't been able to succeed in New York, which is a notorious cutthroat industry on, like, all levels. And, maybe the most ironic thing in the story to me is that Zen only enters through Zaffron, the model. Ray doesn't take up Zen until he takes up with Zaffron. And so this all filters backwards to the title of the story. And, like, the model is both as an idea, right? It's like the perfect human being to make something look the most beautiful, right? Whether that person has any thought inside their head or is the smartest person in the world, you don't know. Because all you're seeing is the exterior, right? And so it's a really interesting thing that Zaffron is really into Zen. And, like, in some ways, is probably way smarter than Ray, because Ray doesn't even understand the Zen that she's trying to help him learn.
Yeah.
And, like, since we never see Zaffron, we don't really know enough about her to say much more than maybe some of those things that I'm thinking are true.
Yeah.
But, like, the fact that we have Zaffron, an elite person, in the fact that she's wealthy, she's beautiful, and presumably pretty smart.
Yeah.
And then we have the child in the Zen riddle, who's just like a passerby, that's a young girl, who's just, like, way smarter than all the students trying to learn Zen from a Zen master. Right, so we have all of these things, like, continuing to circle around, which is why I kind of joke, like, our duck is the same, like, our plight is the same, in a certain manner.
Yeah.
That we are all human and striving to achieve one thing or another, or not be one thing or another. And so, we're all given some of the same qualities, right? In our Homo sapien ways. But, like, then everyone tries to do something with those, like, whatever qualities outside of that, that they're given to like have their duck be the duck picked up at the carnival that on the bottom has the winning prize.
Yeah.
I think that's all incredibly well put, and I hadn't thought about all of that in relation to Zaffron, so I'm grateful for those insights. I think in terms of circularity and the story kind of coming back on itself, I think about the narrator as well, and I think a lot of what I look for in stories is who changes and who doesn't and why. And the narrator's evolution is interesting, I think. So at the end of the story, not quite the end, which I think is even better, and I love it that Eisenberg does this. We get Amos and the narrator meeting up for coffee, and they have a strange interaction. They've stayed in touch, as Adam said, because of this success, but Amos is doing well, but not quite so well. The narrator notices that he's thinner than ever, drawn actually, and that his wonderful pallid luster had dimmed, and she did so well at her last show that she wants to do something generous, and she offers to take him out to a decent dinner, and he says sure in such a concertedly neutral tone that she realizes she'd upset him. This moment really hits, I think, in that just like the narrator, it's complicated. You see that she does notice that she's upset him and that she's trying to treat him kindly. But, this comes a beat after her thinking about the fact that he's just gotten back from touring The Hand That Feeds You. So she's seeing people and failing to see them, and in this moment doesn't take ownership for what she notices. She changes the subject, retreating to more comfortable ground. We also see her sort of speaking about this place and not engaging with, even now that she's more comfortable, what had happened there and the locals and the environmental issues and digging into any of that. She speaks mainly in platitudes. She says, no matter how you feel about a place, it's as though you exchange something with it. It keeps a little bit of you, and you keep a little bit of it. This is her takeaway. We see a little bit of growth there, but not so much. And then the story beautifully folds back to the night of the dinner, and you get the narrator's sort of dreamy perspective on that night and the sky and the stars and the moon that, I'm quoting now, made a path on the sea that looked as though it led straight to heaven, which flows right into dinner, which is clearly the farthest thing from heaven. It's, all of these insipid people talking about nothing, talking not about this play, but about gossip and bullshit, and then you end on this very disingenuous toast. Let us be thankful for our generous hosts, for art, which no one cares about at this table, for this beautiful evening, and for the mild, sunny days ahead. What an opening to this collection it is. I'm curious about what the next story brings. I'm looking for a disaster, but playful disaster.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of playful disaster in Deborah Eisenberg in general, but definitely in the rest of Your Duck Is My Duck. Friends, thank you for flocking together with me today. As always, our duck is the same. Well, you're certainly welcome to my mallards as they come.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.